When did it begin to fall apart in terms of shared ideas so that people stopped speaking to each other?
Yeah.
As you said to me early in this conversation, you could have a pretty famous list of people who stopped talking to you. And
well, there were actually two phases of internecine warfare. One was in the 30s when a lot of people split over the issue of communism and the Communist Party. A lot of the people I'm talking about, there's the older generation, the generation 10 or more years older than I am, had either briefly been communists or been in the orbit, been fellow travelers, and then broke around the 36 when the Moscow trials erupted, or the later on the Nazi-Soviet pact. Anyway, there was a lot of internecine warfare over the break with the Communist Party. There was a second wave of internecine warfare in the 60s in which I participated very centrally.
split on what issue?
Well, on the rise of the New Left, on the rise of the radical movement, a new radicalism, and in some ways it was comparable to the experience of the 30s with the Communist Party. In other words, I personally began the decade as a partisan of the new radical movement, and when I took over commentary, I did a lot to propagate the ideas and attitudes that were then so new that they weren't even identified as the new left or the counterculture. A lot of my older friends in the family were very unhappy with my decision to go that way, to move left. But oddly enough, as I later in the decade became disillusioned with the radical movement, much as some of my elders had become disillusioned with the radicalism of the 30s, some of the people who had been unhappy with me earlier in the decade were moving in the other direction, and we got into a lot of serious battles then, because I was considered an apostate from the true political faith. By this time, the New York Review of Books had been established. It came into being in 1964. In the newspaper strike, right? It was established by people who were then very close friends of mine, more ex-friends, and I was much involved in the founding of that paper, and we had a great split over the new left and over the ideas involved.
But tell me before, what so offended you about? I mean,
the new left.
The new left.
Yeah.
I mean, was it just the opposition to the war?
No. I was myself opposed to the war.
Right. Was it?
No, it was. The fact is that
you can't consider the SDS as somehow a significant force in America.
It was pretty significant at a certain point. I would disagree with that. No, what happened was that that whole movement, particularly on the campuses and within the intellectual community, became increasingly suffused with what can only be called a hatred of this country. People began to talk about this country as though there were no difference between it and Nazi Germany. They would even spell the name of America with a K. They talked about genocide.
Here's what I'm concerned about having you speak to, is the notion there, and you've argued this and debated this in so many hours and hours and hours, and I don't want to sort of try to redo that, but it is the notion of in essence, you thought it was anti-American. That at the core, even of the anti-war movement, was an anti-Americanism. An absence of respect. So,
well, worse than an absence of respect. The idea was that this country was the source, was this what Reagan later called Soviet Union, the focus of evil.
Yeah, or the evil empire.
It wasn't just the kids on campus. I mean, respected journalists writing in places like the New York Times were saying things like. The United States has become the greatest source of violence, evil in the world, and abroad. And most people were saying that the country was so rotten at home that only a revolution could save it. A lot of people were saying that. I remember a professor of philosophy at Columbia saying, you had to be, if you believed that this country was democratic, you should be committed to an insane asylum. I mean, that's almost a direct quotation.
But I also remember a lot of people who felt strongly and who had their patriotism questioned, who shouldn't have, who were opposed to the war, or who felt like that they ought to be able to make a criticism of their country's foreign policy or its domestic policy, whether it was civil rights or whether it was Vietnam, without sort of saying, you know, you want to tear down America.
But nobody, as I say, I myself was a member of the anti-war movement very early on, and I remained very critical of the war. And I certainly was a partisan of the civil rights movement, and I was very close to Bayard Rustin and other leaders of that movement. So the issue wasn't criticizing, and there was always very often a disingenuous effort to confuse criticism with hostility and hatred.
I got not much time. I want to make these points.
Good.
You wrote Making It 1968.
Yeah, it was published in 68. I wrote it in
this was a book in which you said, yes, I'm an intellectual, yes, I want to be published, yes, I like attention, yes, I have all the same personal, emotional forces.
Yeah, I said that was the dirty little secret of American intellectuals, that they wanted success as much as anybody else, worldly success.
Yeah.
And
materialism and the rest, as well as recognition.
Nobody liked that very much.
All right, second book, Breaking Ranks, got a lot of attention too.
Yeah. That was 10 years later. And that was a political memoir, and tried to tell the story, which we've touched on in this conversation, of my break with the left, and my political evolution, which also tried to extend into a kind of political cultural history of the country.
Let me ask you this: what do you regret the most? Whose friendship do you miss the most? What caused you the most pain?
Well, what friendships do I miss the most? I had a lot of very amusing and good friends. I mean, among them, people, I mentioned Norman Mailer already. I always regretted losing the friendship of Lillian Hellman, with whom I once had a lot of fun, although we even then disagreed violently about many political things. I've always regretted, not so much, I could go on naming individuals. Old friend of mine named Jason Epstein, famous publisher. We go back to college, and we once had a lot of fun together. But it's not so much individuals. I do very much miss the world in which I was a young intellectual.
This was the world of public intellectual that I was referring to earlier.
And it was the world of the New York literary intellectuals, the literary political intellectuals, and the conversation was better, wittier, deeper than any conversation I've had the good fortune to come upon since. Of course, partly it had to do with being young and being hungry and being endlessly curious and being introduced to a world that one had looked at in a kind of starstruck spirit from afar. So all that colors my nostalgic memories, and the life I've made since losing that world has been a wonderful life. By the way, I mean I've found new friends and. I've often said that if I hadn't broken ranks, I would either have literally have died, or certainly died as an intellectual, because I would have remained, as by the way some people I knew did, in a false position, saying things they didn't really believe, or not saying things that they really believed.
But there also, and I'm not sure this is the strongest case I can make, but there are people like Bill Buckley of a different maintain friendships, even though he was, one of the articulate forces in the founding of the conservative revolution.
That was not the young Buckley. Buckley mellowed as he went along. But no, I grant you.
Friendship with John Kenneth Galbraith was allowed then.
Yeah, well, and that's all very playful. Right, and there's a kind of showbiz element to it.
Well,
in our case, I have to say that. For people who take ideas very, very seriously, as we all did, it was not easy when you, after being more or less in agreement, it was not easy to maintain the kind of cordial intimacy that you had when you disagreed about the things that were most important to you. So because you either had to avoid talking about what was most important to you, which is unpleasant, or you had to fight all the time, which is even more unpleasant. So you drifted apart. Because it was just too difficult to maintain those relations and have a good time.
I appreciate you coming by. Pleasure to have you on this broadcast.
Appreciate you having me.
Thank you very much. Norman Podhoretz, editor of Commentary.